Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. Well, I was going to do an episode dealing with the Watts finances, in fact, dealing with the bankruptcy report, and I see another creator has beaten me to it and done what looks like a better job than I think I was going to do. So all credit to her. Nice going, Plunder. So instead of doing that, I'm going into something else, the art of the plea deal. And we're going to look at Nikolas Cruz, whose case is still pending. And you may recall that the shootings in Florida at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School happened the same year as the Watts family murders. In fact, the Cruz shooting sort of predated the Watts family murders by almost 6 months. They happened, I think, on Valentine's Day 2018, and the Watts family murders in August the 13th, 2018. And despite the Watts family murders taking place 6 months after the Cruz incident, the Cruz incident still hasn't kind of been heard in court. And that raises some very interesting legal questions. As we all know, the Chris Watts case was sort of rushed, put to bed legally, put in a drawer, and kind of, someone threw away the key. And it's very unlikely that the case is ever going to go to trial, as far as I can see. But the point being that case is already over and done with long ago, more than 2 years ago now, whereas the Florida shootings case with Nikolas Cruz hasn't even begun. And in this episode, we're going to talk a little bit we're going to compare the plea deal in both cases. Before we get to that, I just want to share a little picture that I took from my garden this afternoon. It is of a baby Cape robin bird, and although the birds they sort of nest in shrubbery above the ground, once the chick is a little bit independent, let's say capable of limited flight, then the nesting and the rearing of the chick sort of moves to the ground level, and then the chick is very vulnerable. And when I let my dog out, he immediately went to part of the garden, and then I heard both birds bringing out kind of an alarm call, which is a very specific kind of call that that something is wrong. And since both birds were present, both kind of sounding the alarm, I knew something was up. And I'm just grateful that the dog didn't gobble up this little bird. And I actually managed to get a picture of it, and there it is. And so I just thought I would share that with you. It's the second Cape Robin chick that has been raised in the garden since I've lived where I'm living. So I just thought I would share that with you, and if I take any more photos, I'll try and share those with you as well. Just also a reminder that on Thursday next week, this channel will be starting a new series on John Bonet, going through the timeline, hashtag 24 years ago today, John Bonet, dealing with the events in chronological order. And so that's something to look forward to on this channel. So if you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So what I want to start off with before I get to the art of the plea deal is just to quickly refer to something I meant to say in the video I was going to do about the Watts family finances. And that is just to say, even if we don't know what the Watts finances were, so I'm just saying, if you took everything that we do know about them away, in terms of the bankruptcies and so on, I do think, you might say, well, if you don't know what they are, it means that everything was going well. I don't think so. I think the fact that we don't know, and we haven't known, that this has been kind of almost the most closely guarded secret of the Watts case, perhaps in line with some of the redacted or missing, or how can you put it, incomplete autopsy reports, it's sort of on a par with that, is that very important aspects are missing from the discovery. And I think part of that is the true financial situation of the Watts family. Now, you might say, well, so what? But I don't think it's been a secret because the finances were good. I think it's been a secret, and it's deliberately so, because the finances are bad. They were really, really bad. Bad enough to prompt 2 bankruptcies. And I remember thinking when District Attorney Rourke mentioned in court, he said something like the Watts family had financial problems, but they were just like any other family. No, I think their financial problems were several orders of magnitude worse than the average financial problems that other families have. And I think the death toll in this story is as egregious and grotesque as the debt and the finances were in the Watts family. Okay, and with that, we're going to move on to the art of the plea deal. And what I want to do now is compare the legal strategy, if that's the word, the legal process, the legal journey of Nikolas Cruz, who's now 21 years old. He was 19 years old at the time that he committed his crimes. So we want to compare 19-year-old Nikolas Cruz to 33-year-old Chris Watts, who I think by now is about 35 years old. So we want to compare a 19-year-old teenager to a 33-year-old adult and look at how they've gone about their respective legal journeys. Okay. Now, I recently heard people on YouTube agreeing that Chris Watts is a criminal mastermind, some kind of misunderstood genius. And to be fair, right in the beginning, like in the very early days of the Watts case, I actually credited Watts as being a lot smarter than I think he really is. So, of course, at that time, I didn't know that he'd left the sheet out in plain sight, along with the garbage bags. I didn't know about that. And but I kind of just understood from the way that the crime seemed to have been committed that it was committed within the schema of like the average day going to work. But so for very, very early on, I thought Watts was quite cleverer than most people regarded him then. And it was understandable that people didn't think he was very smart because he was caught as quickly as he was caught, right? And he wasn't very charming. He wasn't very convincing. I mean, he spectacularly failed the polygraph, right? But it's harder to understand people now, 2 years later, who still think that he's some kind of misunderstood genius. I mean, it's clear Watts doesn't even almost qualify for that term. He's not even an idiot savant, right? This is a guy who badly botched an attempted miscarriage twice after it was his idea to have a third child. It was his idea to have a third child in the first place, ostensibly to fix his marriage, and then botched the murders of his own children. I actually had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day, and I'm not going to say too much about him. It's not someone I think I've mentioned before on this channel, but this is a friend who unfortunately is not all that happily married, and he was just telling me having a child with the idea of fixing your marriage is the worst possible idea. He was just saying how the scale of stress just goes up a whole nother level. And it's almost like you're running around after your own tail, and that leads you to not really forget about your problems, but you don't have time to deal with them. And that's not really a good reason to stay married, is it? Because you don't have time to actually deal with the original problems. But anyway, Watts basically thought within the scenario of hemorrhaging finances that having a third child was a good idea. It was actually the worst possible thing that he could have done at that point. There were so many other things that they could have considered. just going back to his intelligence, his own tell-all book arguably was botched as well. He also had a change of heart. He's had a change of heart now, arguing that his prosecution was botched as well. No, he botched his own defense, just as he seriously botched his polygraph, which no one else, just him, dumbly consented to. If anything positive can be said about his intelligence, it's perhaps that he was an above-average mechanic, and let's face it, he gave up on that too. A great way to understand just how idiotic Watts' legal misadventures have been thus far is to compare them to, as I said, 19-year-old Nikolas Cruz. His Valentine's Day massacre at Marjory Stoneman Douglas High School predates the Watts family murders by almost 6 months, and yet Cruz's trial remains in limbo pending a plea deal. Now, although neither Nikolas Cruz nor Chris Watts could have predicted the current predicament that we are all in, but from a legal perspective, I do think that it favors defendants. Now, what I mean is, if you have a case that is in limbo right now, whether you are Robert Durst or Letitia Stork or Laurie Vallow or what's her husband's name, Chad Daybell, or potentially if Chris Watts had rolled the dice and decided to let his case go to trial. So what I'm saying is, in the situation we're in now, where because of coronavirus, court cases can't be safely heard and so are invariably being postponed, a lot is happening that is favoring defendants. To some extent, there's amnesia that is setting in. The lawyers themselves have cases that are accumulating that they can't deal with, which means they've got to start prioritizing what they're going to deal with as it builds up. And not only must lawyers prioritize, courts must as well. Courts have got to say, okay, we can deal with this, we don't have time for that. And to some extent, even prisons are dealing with this situation. Prisons are saying, okay, these are not high priority or high risk individuals, let's let them go. And so that's why I say the coronavirus, legally speaking, kind of favors the defendants, right? And as time goes by, the memory and you can call it the emotional memory of the events is fading away. And if you take what Nikolas Cruz did, it shocked America, it arguably shocked the world. But as time is going by, the feeling of revenge, if that's the word, the feeling of wanting justice is just slowly ebbing away, which happens as time passes. And the longer that happens, the just by very gradual degrees does this need to pursue justice start to dissipate, right? And so the longer that these cases are postponed or put on the back burner, the more it favors the defense to sort of get away with whatever they're going to get away with, possibilities of mitigation of sentence and all this kind of thing. And so in this sense, Nikolas Cruz has been quite fortunate. I think there's a possibility that even given the crimes that he's committed, that prosecutors, a judge, may be slightly more willing to give him what he wants in order to avoid a long drawn-out court case, which no one wants in the middle of a coronavirus pandemic. Nobody wants a long court case, let alone kind of just a normal court case. And a case like his, where there are 17 victims, would be a long court case. Same with the Chris Watts case, where there were 3 victims and the unborn child. That would also be a relatively long court case. And so, the relevant courts don't feel like they could really afford that right now, besides all the other contextual aspects. But I do think, if you look at the Cruz case, it's a very real scenario of whether he should get the death penalty. I mean, the Cruz case is a case where the death penalty is almost it's almost intuitive that you're going to say, well, this should be a death penalty case, isn't it? And what Nikolas Cruz is arguing is that he will take a plea deal, he'll accept guilt on all charges. There's no question that he is guilty of premeditated murder, and then save everyone the trouble, and he just goes to jail. And as time is going by, I think it favors him. And of course, had Chris Watts been in the same situation, you never know, the same thing could have played out. In fact, in Colorado, I think at the beginning of this year, they actually changed the capital punishment legislation. I'm not 100% sure whether a crime that occurred before that was changed would necessarily be impacted by the legislation. I don't know if it works retrospectively. I'm not quite sure, but I've got a feeling that it could have had an impact on his case. If there was no death penalty, then Chris Watts had kind of nothing to fear. On the other hand, I do suspect that Chris Watts, it may not have necessarily have to do with the death penalty directly anyway. It may have had to do with that he felt that his days were going to be numbered if he ended up in the general population of any prison, right? And I think he sort of felt that he needed to be protected from that aspect, from that death penalty. What I think he didn't know, and this again goes to his intelligence, is it was up to the state to protect him, no matter how evil a murderer he was. It's up to the state to actually protect high-profile prisoners, whether it's Stephen Avery or Nikolas Cruz or whoever it is, Scott Peterson. And obviously if something happens to a high-profile prisoner, someone's going to have to answer to why something did happen. And so more than likely he would have ended up where he ended up anyway, which is why taking the plea deal or offering the plea deal was quite idiotic, I think. In terms of an article, I think it's on CNN, talking about Cruz, the defense team offered a plea deal in exchange for life in prison without the possibility of parole, but only if prosecutors took the death penalty off the table. But prosecutors have rejected the plea, meaning a lengthy trial is all but inevitable. And that's a quote from an article on CNN dealing with Nikolas Cruz. I think this appetite for a long trial is diminishing, as I've said. Now, it's interesting that the reverse happened in the Watts case. Prosecutors accepted the plea deal and did so apparently at the behest of the victim's family. But the point is, a plea deal makes sense in Cruz's case. He very clearly faces and deserves the death penalty, so we can see how it's to the advantage of the defendant to offer the plea deal. In the Watts case, it was clearly to the advantage of the prosecution to accept a plea deal, especially given the lack of clear, unambiguous forensic evidence. Just to emphasize that point, we still don't know the time of death of any of the victims. We don't know for sure whether Shanann was killed immediately after she entered the residence or several hours later. We don't know for sure which child was killed first, and we can't be absolutely sure that the children were strangled, smothered, sedated, overdosed, or whatever was the case. I have my doubts that they were asphyxiated, just because I don't know whether we can rely on the autopsy reports, but there's no sign of petechial hemorrhages in the children, and also no sign of kind of fibers in their lungs or something like that if they were smothered with something. And you would expect fibers or something like that to be in their lungs if that was the case, and they're not. So it would have been to the advantage of the prosecution in this case to accept a plea deal, because there's so little evidence in this case, whether in terms of the autopsies, whether in terms of the crime scene, etc., etc. What we see here, in a sense, is a teenager playing a savvier legal game than Watts has, and with the deck stacked against him. I mean, to the degree that's far worse than in the Watts case. Does that make sense? I'm not going to take it further than that. There are a couple of things I've got on a checklist that I want to get through in terms of this particular case, but if there's a particular area that you would like discussed in terms of Chris Watts, let me know and I'll have a look at it. Meanwhile, as I say, bear in mind there is TCRS merch available at a link in the description, and also keep your eyes open for the series on John Benet Ramsey starting next Thursday. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.